I guess we could get it going. There's a quorum. So hi, Colleen. So anyways, I'm Carrie. I'm from the Book Beat, and Julie and I have been we were trying to talk about how long we've done this for 3 years, and it just sort of came. We kind of joked about it, she said, and it just kind of fell together. And I said, well, let's just do it. And the first one, I think we had a group of Ray correspondents, right? It was like about 3 or 4 of his kind of long-term correspondence.
Yeah, I think the first year we were kind of doing it with the interviews book that I edited, and then we had a few
Yeah, this
people
is
who,
Julie's book here.
yeah, we had a few people who were in the book or related to the book in some way who we invited in. And then last year we were excited because we had both John Walters, who was
Yeah.
the director of How to Draw a Bunny, and then Ellen Levy, sorry, wrong, Levy like Chevy, Ellen Levy like Chevy, who zoomed in for tonight. So that's really exciting. So
Thank
we
you.
had, someone who's working on a Ray Johnson book and someone who made the classic Ray Johnson movie. So,
Right.
and then tonight we've got 2 new scholars. So we're very excited about that.
So I think we should just begin. Ellen, I was just going to ask you a question. Any updates about your book?
Mm, good
Yeah, coming out August 24. I'm
point.
working on the layouts with the designer now, which just are gorgeous. I love them.
Great. Well, can I count you in as our guest for next year?
Oh, for sure. Oh, bells
Yeah.
on. Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks.
There's a couple more people coming in. And so well, this is fun.
Wonderful. Well,
Okay.
I'll
So why don't
introduce who we. Oh,
yeah. I'm gonna sort of cut out or blank out and but I'll be around. And if you have a chat question, you could send it to me. And I think at the end of both presentations, we'll do the questions so I could see them in the chat. Okay. All right, Julie,
sounds good.
take
Thanks, Gary.
take it away.
um, I love too that Carrie's bookstore is in Michigan. So we always also have definitely Michigan being a part of our annual Ray Johnson unbirthday celebration. Even though we're in the Zoomiverse together. But tonight, I'm so pleased to introduce all of you to 2 new scholars. I've just met them recently. Also, they both emailed me before I met them in person, which is always exciting when you're like, oh, here's someone new working on Ray Johnson. And then you actually get to meet them. So I heard presentations by both Alex and Kira at the recent Reviewing Black Mountain College conference. They wowed me there, so I think they'll wow us all tonight. But just a brief kind of intro for both of them. I'll give their bios and then we'll go. So Alex will present first, followed by Kira. And I think we're thinking their presentations are anywhere between 10 and 20 minutes. So we'll have short talks by each of them. And then we'll open it up for questions. But yeah, just put a question in anytime you want. But I'm so pleased to share the work of these 2 new Ray Johnson scholars. After I saw their presentations at the Reviewing Black Mountain College conference, I said, these are the scholars that Bill Wilson would have loved and embraced and that I have been waiting for. So anyone who knows Bill Wilson, I think he would really have enjoyed meeting these 2. Alex Landry will discuss her master's thesis on Ray Johnson's letters from Black Mountain College. This is correspondence between Lorna Blaine and Ray Johnson. And this was part of Alex's thesis research at Tulane University. And currently Alex is a curatorial assistant at the Newcomb Art Museum in New Orleans. So we even have a Ray Johnson scholar in New Orleans these days, which is very exciting. And then Kira Houston will discuss his recent work with Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center, where Kira works as the Outreach and Education Coordinator. And recently, the Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center just released volume 14, which is very exciting, of the Journal of Black Mountain College Studies. So this is an open access free journal. It's also only digital, but the neat part of it being digital is you can submit or publish anything in a variety of mediums. So it can be text, but it can also be video, images, photos, audio, etc. But Kira is going to talk about a little bit about the journal, but then his article that appears in the journal. And he'll also discuss his undergraduate thesis, which is titled Queer Relationality, Ray Johnson's Silhouettes as Glyphs, Dumps, Letters, and Holes. And Kira just finished his bachelor's degree from Clark University in Massachusetts. So so excited to share these. And Alex, I think we can turn it on over to you.
Sure. So I'm going to share screen, and bear with me in this share screen process. But let's see the full slideshow. All right, do we see this? You see the slides? Yes, wonderful. So thank you, Julie, for introducing me, and Carrie and Julie for organizing this. I mean, this is so exciting to come, right after the BMC conference just a little over a week ago, we were just saying. To reintroduce myself a little bit, I'm Alex. I'm a second-year MA student at Tulane University in the Art History program in the Newcomb Art Department. I think we were also just talking about how Ray might have appreciated this format, and I think he absolutely would have found it hilarious to have people, communicating over little boxes in our little collage corners. So I really appreciate that. And I'm going to start this presentation with my current work on Johnson, which relates mostly to my thesis. The title I'm showing you here, Seeing Relatedness, Matiere, Ray Johnson's Queer Formalism and BMC. And this is a presentation that I showed at the BMC conference, but there will be little bits and pieces that come from my previous work. So I'm going to go to the end to my current work and then kind of slingshot to the beginning, which really started during the summer of 2022. So at the past BMC conference that took place a little over a week ago, I presented this talk that argued that Ray Johnson was engaging with what I'm calling, and what has been called by a few other scholars, queer formalist strategies in his collage and mail art practice during his during his study under Joseph Albers at BMC, which for him was between 1945 and 48, as I'm sure most of you are pretty aware. And in that paper, I suggested that the same way that Albers' lessons encouraged a reckoning with the limits of perception to offer a true or authentic representation of visual phenomena, so too does contemporary queer theory, as I'm exemplifying here in the work of Judith Butler. So too does queer theory tell us that drag and other forms of gender performativity are examples meant to establish that reality is not as fixed as we generally assume it to be. And to illustrate this, I offered a visual analysis of Johnson's letters to Lorna Blaine Halper, which you're seeing on the left right here, that situated them in the context of formal and perceptual lessons from Joseph Albers, including the Matiere study and the Matiere scale, which you're seeing on the respectively on the bottom and top here, the bottom being by Wanda Schultz-Lee Austin and the top by Laura Cadden Lindenfeld. But it also includes lessons called disposing, Albers' insistence on economical design. And in my thesis, I also touch on the rearrangement exercises and the Schwindel, among others. And my goal in illustrating this was dual-pronged. So first, I wanted to demonstrate how Johnson's seemingly absolute transition to collage in the 50s and 60s actually had precedence in his work at BMC, beyond, let's say, the more abstract geometric paintings that he was engaged in like the late 40s and early 50s. But secondly, I wanted to suggest the theory that Albers was teaching a kind of queer formalism that advocated for careful attention, and importantly, taught his students to undo some of their conditioned forms of interpreting vision, or as I said in my talk, unteaching visual presumption. However, what I don't want to be misconstrued is that Albers was in any way a queer ally as we think of today, nor am I suggesting that he even consciously promoted this queer formalism as I'm describing it in his courses. The kinds of activities that Albers offered in classes were crucially not, at least from what I can tell in his view, methods that produced final artworks. But despite Albers insisting that his exercises only produced studies or were viewed in this sort of exercise framework, I argue Johnson later takes up many of these same principles in his career and in his practice. And we see a seed of this interest in early letters to Halper at a period when, again, he was notably still devoted to painting, and as Julie has also written largely about on graphic design and commercial design projects. Yeah, so this is kind of the full scale of these two works that I'm showing you all. Now, the reason I think this idea of queer formalism offers valuable insight into Johnson's practice is because so many scholars have already unpacked the more explicitly queer tactics in Johnson's work, although I hope that there's so much more work in that endeavor as well. You have Kira Houston, of course, look at this, a queer scholar here, but also Jose Esteban Munoz discussing queer futurity in Johnson's work. You have Miriam Kindly and Gillian Pistol discussing his work in terms of network theory. You have Benjamin Kahan's anti-archival and sadomasochistic framework. You have Mason Klein and Jonathan Weinberg in the correspondences catalog. And of course, the recent exhibition, What a Dump, with Jarrett Ernst's wonderful essay as well. Now, one second. So in all of these very necessary readings of Johnson's work that I've just, spoken of, his queer strategies are generally characterized as social, subversive, and generally characterized in a context of a burgeoning underground queer New York scene. And this is all following his leave of BMC, of course. My writing, however, seeks to explore what it would mean to see Johnson's strategies or his queer strategies predating these readings. And if not rooted in an explicitly queer context or in a New York queer context, and we can certainly say that BMC had its own different extant queer context, what formal methods did Johnson inherit here that we can interpret as queer? Now, queer formalism and queer abstraction are recent terms. I don't believe that they've been canonized even for 10 years. And they've been used by scholars such as William J. Simmons, Lex Morgan Lancaster, who I'm showing you up here, David Getze and Jennifer Doyle, to discuss artworks which do not directly represent queer identity, but rather employ queer methods upon materials in order to demand more critical and haptic engagements with the viewer, or else they thematize experiences of bodily queerness via transformations of the material. Now, in 2010, another scholar, Thomas Foland, published a dissertation that called or addressed Robert Rauschenberg's queer modernism, which essentially stated that Rauschenberg's use of quotidian or decorative, even debased objects was a way of queering modernism via the identities of the materials. This was an inspiring read for me, but I was left wondering if such arguments still relied on connotations of queerness, which at best advocated for more accessible and popular media, but at worst, reinforcing ideas of queerness as necessarily involving low or even trashy materials, which there is a place for. The model of queer formalism, at least in my conception of it, has allowed me to consider how artists like Ray are engaging with queer methods of working with materials that place less of an importance on the identities of both the artist and materials involved, and rather on the site of engagement with materials via artists and viewers, or collaborators, because correspondence in Johnson's term. So it's within this framework of queer formalism that I began to think of Ray's work as compatible with ideas from contemporary artists like Gordon Hall, who produced sculptures for the express purpose of having people physically interact with them in order to learn about how their bodies relate to others in space. The whole idea is that instead of functioning at a distance and autonomously, that art can lead us into a functional, or can lead us through its functional identity as objects, and quoting Hall here, can teach us how to see bodies without demanding explanations of them. Now, I see this idea clearly reflected in Lessons with Albers, in which he would teach students through haptic exercises like the matière, how materials can subvert our expectations, and further that this process of interpretation and discovery is often continuous, and that one can take joy out of the realization that our senses are limited in determining sensory information. And so this is a further performance that Gordon Hall did, I believe in 2018. But you can see how there's all these people in the audience. It's very interactive, and it's always using the objects physically. So that's my current work with Ray, this long thesis that I actually turned in the long draft of last week. Woohoo! But yes, thank you. But it actually began over the summer of 2022 during a curatorial internship at the Asheville Art Museum. And I'd love to take a moment to thank all of those people who, none of which are here right now, but they really encouraged and supported me through my initial explorations with Ray. And they're just a wonderful team over there if you're ever over at that museum. So like with most projects, my finding of Ray's work was partially chance and partially intent. I started the internship about a semester into my grad program and hadn't chosen a thesis topic yet. And actually, I was hung up on a gap of about 100 years that was, in my view, at least, preventing me from discussing the queer material strategies in the sculpture of Auguste Rodin, which we can come back to. And I'm still hoping Johnson will lead me back there. Part of my internship involved digitizing the permanent collection for their online database, this is at Asheville, which were part of a gift from the estate of Lorna Blaine Halper to the Asheville Art Museum in 2012. Out of that digitization project, I developed an exhibition called Dear Lorna, Love Ray, that is currently available on the museum's website if you all want to check it out, where you can view all of his letters from Johnson to Halper during the spring of 1947. And so here I'm showing you some of the photographs that I actually got to take and put into their database. And this other photo in the bottom right is me physically trying to figure out how to make a digital, exhibition. I was trying to do a checklist, sort of, move objects around like you would for a physical exhibition, which was very funny to do, to like bring it to the physical, to go back to the digital space. So I thought that was a fun little showcase there. And there were so many fascinating relationships encapsulated in these letters. And instead of my conference talk, where I go very in depth into various scholars' work that relate to how I'm bringing these letters into a queer formalist perspective, I want to talk about some of these connections that are super fun and that I think still relate very much to my thesis. So let's see if this will move. Okay. So Halper and Johnson both shared doodles and sketches featuring the spiral motif at this time, which could be inspired by a variety of different sources. I suggest it could have been Max Dane, his philosophy of mathematics, or whatever that class was called, that was just wonderfully blending so many theories with math, sort of an organic math class. Or it could have been a series of line exercises with Albers, or perhaps their shared interest in Paul Klee, who I'll also touch on in a moment. While for Johnson, the spiral becomes one of so many other motifs that he plays with over the years, for Halper, it became foundational for multiple series of works in 2D and 3D mediums. So on the left, I'm showing you one of the spiral doodles that Johnson sends to Halper in the spring of 1947. And on the right, this is one of Halper's doodles during her time at BMC, which, while we don't know the exact year, we know that Halper was at BMC during 45 to 48. So the same time as Johnson, basically. Am I missing a slide? No, here it is. Okay. And here, so looking further into their career, on the left, I'm showing you all of my favorite mid-career Xeroxes by Johnson. Again, we don't know the exact year, but probably like after the 70s. And in this work, he has a copy of Alfred Jarry's late 19th century woodcut of Père Ubu from the play Ubu Roy. And he's juxtaposed this woodcut with his own spiral snake snail motif, although if there's a proper name for that, Johnson scholars do let me know. Aligning himself with the performative avant-garde tradition. I mean, this is just so hilarious, right? Like, he's taken Ubu Roy and made it completely his own as a Xerox, as a snake. And I think since Jarry was also only 23 when he wrote this play, I think like he's clearly bringing this connection between himself and this writer, very similar to how he does with Rainer Maria Rilke, having written Cornet in one night at the age of 24. I think Johnson has all these relationships with 19th century younger artists and avant-garde members. And then on the other hand, Halper's works take up the spiral and linear designs throughout her practice, as shown by these two late sculptures cast in metal. And for both of these works, she does multiples. There are multiple panels of the one in the center. There are multiple busts of the one on the right. So this spiral form that usually takes over the whole head just reappears across her practice. And in other works that are drawing based, she's doing these extensive op art, linear, these wonderful, expansive, linear drawings that I absolutely recommend y'all look into. But they're both reconciling with it at this time at BMC, which I find absolutely fascinating. But there are further connections. So Okay, so here on the left again, at the top, you'll see one of Johnson's letters to Halper. It includes a Paul Klee painting actor's mask at the center. And then at the bottom left, I'm showing you a drawing by Halper, again, exact year unknown, but she's using these sort of mathematical vectors to design a face. So again, connecting this interest in math and interest in composing the body. And then on the right is another sort of fragment of a letter that Johnson sent to Halper, again, drawing on this face that in all of these, I'm seeing this reference to Klee. But on the right is a print from 1948 by Fanny Hillsmith, who was an abstractionist and surrealist who taught at Black Mountain College starting in 1945. And actually, a funny story that comes out of their relationship was that Fanny Hillsmith actually taught Halper while she was in high school. And before Halper came to BMC, her parents said that because it was thought of as a nudist colony and all these other references to BMC that were unsavory, said that she couldn't go unless Hillsmith was her chaperone, which is what ended up happening. And she came to BMC. And so there's all these wonderful like connections between Hillsmith's interest in Cubism and surrealism, and of course, Klee, and bringing that forward to talk to Halper and Johnson about. And beyond that, there was this real obsession with Klee at the time, not only through Albers, of course, but even Betty Schmidt, who would later be Urbain, remembering all these names. But Betty also had an interest in Klee as well, and her parents had a collection of some kind. So it was really like sort of in the air, this interest in Klee. So yeah. Okay, and then at the Western Regional Archives, I also discovered presumably one of Johnson's last letters to Halper, who he had continued to be in correspondence with throughout his life. This letter actually comes from 1994, the year before he died. And in this letter, they've corresponded a few times over the same materials. So this piece of paper that I'm showing you in the middle, Johnson initially wrote add 2, and then he writes, of course, T plus O equals 2. But then the blue is Halper responding and adding her own materials on top of it. And I'm pretty sure, though this is not confirmed, but I'm pretty sure that Halper is the one who included these high school photos of both herself and Johnson that are from the early 40s, soon before they would have met, which I thought was very touching. And this is also in the Western Regional Archives. Again, I have to just say, like, to demystify all of this, like the Western Regional Archives, the Ray Johnson Estate, the Asheville Art Museum, none of this would have been possible without their support. And I feel so lucky to be at a time when my research can be supported in this way. So I have to thank them. But further connections. Besides Halper, whom Johnson sent his BMC letters to, there were a series of connections to another peer and artist, Ruth Asawa, who also sent hand-constructed letters to Halper in these same months. In one example here on the left, she uses construction paper that was likely adhered together in a similar way to most of Johnson's envelopes, which are taped together at the sides. They're just flat sheets of construction paper that he folds and tapes. But in two other examples, Halper uses a bright pink, Asawa uses a bright pink streaked paper that she claims came from a Valentine's Day party at the college. Unlike Johnson's letters, Asawa carefully and complexly folded her substrates such that they maintain a real three-dimensionality, kind of like paper accordions. And all three of them were like this. It was very unique. And immediately when I saw this kind of streaking in the paper, I hope that that's coming through over the internet. I think that's easier to see on a screen, honestly, than at the conference. But you see this again in his letters to Halper. Again, all in the same month between February and March. Right. And so I hope this shows just how explicitly connected their ideas were at this time. They were sharing the same paper, like they were talking about the same things. And then in a contemporaneous letter to Barbara Bobby Dreyer, Johnson and Asawa co-authored a short cartoon illustration depicting what I would argue is perhaps Ted Dreyer and Bobby at the time walking through the woods. While the letter is only signed by Johnson, and it's only on the front, only on the envelope itself, Johnson has signed the envelope. We can see that Asawa clearly designed many of the illustrations within based on her drawings at this time. And thankfully, I was able to find this drawing on the right on blue paper is actually at the Western Regional Archives. It's another letter to Halper at the same time, while these two images on the left actually come from the Asheville Art Museum and were credited to Johnson. So this is a theory, but yeah, I think it just goes to show how connected they were. And so, yeah, this is a further extension of that same cartoon illustration that I argue was co-authored by Johnson and Asawa. It's very cute. I'm really upset that we didn't get to put it up on you won't find it on the digital exhibition actually, but I think that bits of it are in the database. So you might be able to see it still through the database. But what I'd like to get across here that I didn't get to make space for in my conference or in my thesis is that these letters represent some of Johnson's initial artistic experiments using the mail system, experiments which very much referenced, and in the Dreyer example, actually included the work of his peers. While it's now lost to the record, Halper may have been constructing her own handmade letters that Johnson later cut up and used in fragments in his collages, or that's what I dream, perhaps. So much like Albert's class exercises that took place in a collaborative setting and were critiqued in a collaborative setting, Johnson's letters also engage in this collaborative spirit. And so thank you. That's a little piece of my presentation. I really appreciate y'all being here. I'll stop sharing. Here we go.
That's wonderful, Alex. Thank you so much for sharing it, but also sharing a different piece. I hope if there's time at the end, though, you will maybe have a little bit to talk about some of how you were reading the materiality that you shared at the conference, because I think some of the folks in this crowd would love to hear a little bit, if you can give us just like a shorter version of that from your paper. But this is so exciting. I will try to find the link to the exhibition to put it in the chat for everyone, but definitely check out what Alex digitized. And also thanks for also sharing, like, this didn't fit here and this didn't fit here, but I want to share it in this session tonight. Wonderful. So
I'll go ahead and grab that link really quick.
That'd be wonderful. You know exactly where it is. So I think we'll kind of shave any questions and discussion to the end. So Kira, if you're ready, we'll hand it over to Kira Houston. And I gave a brief introduction, but if anyone tuned in late, Kira is currently the Outreach and Education Coordinator at the Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center here in Asheville, and was involved in the Queer Studies issue of which is the new volume in the new issue of the Journal of Black Mountain College Studies, which I did put that link in the chat. All right, Kira, it's all you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Let me get my screen share up here. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm really honored to have spoken after Alex once again. We presented in the same order at the conference because what I presented at the conference has a lot to do with the very end of Johnson's life. And so it's a little bit of a kind of chronological Ray Johnson. So in my talk today, with you guys, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Journal of Black Mountain College Studies in my professional role as outreach coordinator for the Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center, which is a completely different museum from the Asheville Art Museum, but they're located basically 2 blocks from each other. And I'm actually the outreach coordinator, not the education coordinator, but education does fall under my purview, by the way, in case anyone emails me and wonders why that's missing from my signature. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our latest volume of the journal to give that some press, and hopefully you guys will be interested to go and read it and maybe submit yourselves someday. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my research focus, which is Ray Johnson's silhouettes. And so I just graduated from my undergraduate degree at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And now I'm in this amazing role at the Black Mountain College Museum, slowly becoming a bit of a Black Mountain College expert myself, because as you can imagine, working at the Black Mountain College Museum, my 9 to 5 is completely consumed by Black Mountain College, which is incredible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on silhouettes, which I completed an undergraduate thesis focusing on that topic, and which I'm hoping to continue researching well into the future and turn it into many more projects. So I'll begin talking a little bit about our journal, and I do have a script here, and the latter part is actually lifted from my script from the conference, but I'm going to play a little fast and loose with the script, so bear with me. I was also talking in Spanish for an hour before this, so bear with me. I'm going to try to stay in my English mode. I want to present our newest volume of the journal. The Journal of Black Mountain College Studies is an open access and completely online publication of the museum. It actually grew out of our annual Black Mountain College conference, the Reviewing Black Mountain College International Conference that we host here in Asheville, and that Julie and Alex and I were able to attend just over a week ago, which was just an incredible experience, and it's an amazing conference. We had a beautiful turnout this year, and if any of you have the chance to come in the future, it is a totally amazing experience to get in this community with other Black Mountain College scholars. So our journal is not peer-reviewed, but it is rigorously edited by a group of Black Mountain College scholars, including editor Thomas Frank and our newly departing editor, Carissa, who was a staff with the museum for a long time, is now accepting a new role at the libraries, special collections, the Buncombe County Public Library here in Asheville. And so, and then myself, I work now as the kind of production editor for the journal on that side, because in addition to being our outreach and education person, I'm also our web design person. So that's a little bit about our amazing journal. This is our 14th volume. It's probably one of the longest and most thorough and robust volumes that we've published to date. And the volume is themed all around this topic of queer life at Black Mountain College. So shout out to Aunt Lobo, who was the guest editor for this volume and brought everything together along with Tom and Carissa. The volume is like just incredible. It's not only scholarly academic work of incredible quality, but there are also artworks, multimedia works. There's a visual essay that are included within the volume, as well as a performance piece that was done with the museum a long time. Well, it was like, I think in 2018. That date might not be totally right. And then we've republished it with a volume as well because of the kind of resonance. So you can access this all totally for free online. Please check it out. I have an article that appeared in the volume, and so does Alex, and they're both about Ray Johnson. Ray Johnson also appears at the end of Emilio's article, and he might even be mentioned in more of the articles that I'm not even thinking of. So it's a whole Ray Johnson moment here at the journal, and we've actually published volume previous that was completely focused around Ray Johnson journal and many others about Ray Johnson. So I would totally encourage everyone here consider the journal as a potential home for some of your scholarship one day, especially anything that might have a hard time finding a home in a traditional journal, something that's multimedia, has video components, something that is web native. We're super excited about work like that. So there's my little plug. And finally, well, not finally, I still have a ways to go, but I wanted to give you guys a window into my project about Ray Johnson's silhouettes. So I'm going to play a little fast and loose here with my script, but I wanted to talk, and this is not for my talk at the conference. So Julie and Alex, you'll be excited. These are things that you've never heard before. I wanted to talk a little bit about how I kind of came to be interested in silhouettes and how I think that they are an important thing to understand in kind of context with the rest of Johnson's life and work. So for those of you who may or may not know, in 1976, Ray Johnson began a project that was called Silhouette University, for which he ended up tracing more than 200 silhouette outlines of friends, acquaintances, art world names, names including BMC figures like Ruth Asawa, and then a lot of other people from the New York circle, like Namjoon Pike, Chuck Close, David Hockney, and Andy Warhol. And these silhouettes become a kind of feature in Ray Johnson's collages for, as soon as he makes them, they kind of become a feature for the rest of his entire life. And so when I first became interested in Johnson's work, so my background is kind of as an illustrator, as a sci-fi fantasy illustrator, but also as a collage artist and a variety of different forms. And I was really interested in digging into what made Ray Johnson kind of different from other collage artists or combination artists or found material artists or so-called pop artists. And I was really interested in these recurring motifs he has that, drawing on what you were talking about a little bit, Alex, that are almost kind of like cartoons or make him kind of a cartoonist. And I was interested in that iconographic standpoint of deciphering this visual language that he has and what really makes that unique and like super different from, for example, like Rauschenberg or something. And I started seeing all these silhouettes and I was like, what the heck are these? Who are they? Where did they come from? Did he make these? The answer is yes, he did make all of them. And so I began my investigation into silhouettes. And when I started looking at them, what I realized actually is that silhouette is not only a term that applies to these human profile silhouettes that he creates through the Silhouette University project. It's actually a term that theoretically I apply across Johnson's entire career. And I think that silhouetting as a play between positive and negative space, absence and presence, silhouettes and silhouetting are things that I view as key theoretical concepts for looking at really the evolution of Johnson's background in graphic design and maybe pictorial cartoon into the entire rest of his work. And so let me go to my next slide here. My thesis is entitled Queer Relationality, Ray Johnson's Silhouettes as Glyphs, Dumps, Letters, and Holes. And so I use each of these specific Johnsonian terms to construct silhouettes in a different way and to kind of trace them throughout his career. And so in glyphs, I'm actually looking at silhouettes as language. So I actually argue that every single letter in a typescript is actually a silhouette. And it's kind of a line, but a line actually has a space of its own. And so I actually view those as silhouettes and as something that has a tension between absence and presence and readability and unreadability. And so I kind of dive into those as resonant with Johnson's early graphic design work and some of his commercial work. So that's the section all about glyphs. Then I move into looking at this version of queer relationality, which is actually a type of queer formalism. Thank you, Alex, for explaining what that means. And queer relationality is my term, kind of for the way that the formal technique of placing all of these disparate images and references through the process of queer relationality and free association. Thank you, Ellen Levy. I'm about to quote you later in my talk. And how all of that creates this kind of dumping ground or this kind of sounding board. And that term, many thanks to Jarrett from the exhibition, Ray Johnson, What a Dump. I did not invent the term dump, but I very Ray Johnson-like have appropriated it for use in this chapter, all about his collages. Finally, moving into the chapter about letters, which of course is all about the silhouettes traveling through the mail and what that entails. And I did want to include this example that I didn't really talk about at the conference, but it's in my article online. You could read about it. This is an incredible Ray Johnson letter that's housed at the Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center. And it's a letter from Johnson to Elaine Schmidt-Urbane. And this is one of the earliest silhouettes that I've actually found. And it has a spiral for an eye, which is very fascinating. And so I know, right? So I'm tracing this lineage of silhouettes all the way back to the beginning, right? He's been interested in this idea of the contours of the face forever and ever. So what I'm going to do today is read you guys a little bit from the final chapter of this work, which is about silhouettes as wholes. Very proud to say that wholes is completely my terminology. I didn't steal it from anyone else who made an amazing exhibition about Ray Johnson. It came fresh from my mind. And I think that this segment of the research really encapsulates my overarching theory about silhouettes and the kind of conceptual resonance of silhouettes as a motif. Like, out of all of Ray Johnson's formal strategies and motifs and iconography, what is unique about silhouettes? Why would he decide to use silhouettes? And so this section is kind of where I dive into that. So, next slide. My touchscreen didn't work. So here is an example of Johnson tracing a silhouette from his Silhouette University project. This is Chuck Close, and so the way that Johnson created these was by actually physically posing the model up against the wall, tracing the silhouette, and then that outline can be made into a positive or negative space, or even kept as a line, although I actually haven't really seen that very often, and included as a kind of element in the collages. And so thinking about silhouettes, I actually became interested in this kind of paradox of silhouettes as whole, teach us about the coexistence of nothingness and anythingness, which is the last one is a term that I invented within Johnson's life and work. So we all know that Johnson performed these avant-garde experimental performances that are called nothings, and he published a book about death. And of course, there is the end of his life. And so I found throughout my research that it was actually kind of easy to maybe read Ray Johnson's life as something that is a tragic story or like a cynical story. But I found a tension there where Ray Johnson has also become this crucial figure for queer theory and such projects as Jose Esteban Munoz's Cruising Utopia, which is just this incredible book that is foundational to this field of queer futurity. And so Ray Johnson in that case is being taken up for this project that is wholly optimistic and extremely future focused. And so my question was, how do you get this figure who performs nothings and writes books about death? And then Jose Esteban Munoz is like, this guy is completely emblematic of queer futurity. And so I think that silhouettes are a window into that paradox, which I like to call the paradox of nothingness and anythingness. So throughout this section, essentially, I will argue that for Ray Johnson, nothing means anything, but not in the way that you might think. So Johnson actually sees nothingness not as a void or as this all-consuming black hole in which nothing can enter, but rather as a potentiality. So if something means nothing, that means it can actually at any moment suddenly mean anything. And for Ray Johnson, that's a really exciting potential. So, for example, when we look at the phrase nothing means anything, we can actually translate it as emptiness means possibilities. So to explore this paradox, I talk about silhouettes as wholes, which are both devoid of meaning and bursting with potentiality. I argue that nothingness suggests this parallel radical potential of anythingness. And when the signifiers become detached from their signifieds, they don't become static, but they rather transform into these wholes that our minds seek to fill with new meanings. Furthermore, silhouettes, because of their unique physicality and their historic and visual qualities, which I will get to in just a minute, are particularly ripe to help Johnson explore this paradox and to help us unpack it. So I want to give a brief little moment here about the origin of the human profile silhouette. The profile silhouette has its roots as a pre-photographic method of capturing a person's likeness. So before we had photography, this was a way to really get in there and feel like you had a representation of someone that was close to their ideal self or their real self. So sometimes this is like romantically, as in this kind of myth of this Corinthian maid who traces her lover's silhouette before he goes to war as a kind of recuerdo, sorry, Spanish brain. But sometimes this is also violently expressed, as in the case of these 18th and 19th century silhouettes that are reproducing the likeness of enslaved people as a proof of purchase. And so for a contemporary artist who's exploring this side of the history of silhouettes, please look to Carl Walker. I'm hoping that my next presentation about silhouettes can have a whole kind of Carl Walker section. Anyway, this is the thing about silhouettes. They provide a representation of identity that's somewhere between a portrait and a fingerprint. So they're condensing an individual's personality into only the contours of their profile. So it's like still suggesting a human face, like a portrait, like a painted portrait or a photographic portrait, but it's also creating this one-of-a-kind symbolic marker, like a fingerprint, like the spiral of a fingerprint. So while silhouettes are in some ways anonymizing, removing all of the naturalistic detail from a person's face, they have also been used throughout history as identification. And so I think that Ray exploits this paradox of the anonymizing and identifying nature of silhouettes to uniquely position them as collage elements. I argue that their function is to take part in a queer relational process, which Ellen Levy calls free association. Here I'm quoting you, Ellen. The Freudian term free association describes, oh, this is not quoting you yet. This is myself still. I got confused by the quotations. This is describing Johnson's semiotic methodology of linking people, places, and things on the basis of chance connections. Now I'm quoting Ellen, saying that Johnson came to see the self-enclosed, self-sufficient image as a trap. What began to matter to him most were not things or people, but the constantly shifting relations between them, end quote. So in this sense, he was viewing associations and substitutions and double meanings all as radically transformative potentials that are both enjoyable and productive. And so you can already see how this kind of idea of queer relationality and free associations and the connections between people and places and things is resonating conceptually with this anythingness, with this potentiality of meaning from the void of the whole of the silhouette. So going back to silhouettes, in his artistic practice, Ray Johnson is using like real people to create the profile of silhouettes. Then he's repurposing them in his collages. He's therefore including the personalities while also occluding them. And this is where we get to the silhouettes kind of as these dumps or sounding boards. The silhouettes continue to signify the people that they were originally traced from, but the personalities coexist with Johnson's own symbolic language. In this way, Johnson merges people with words, objects, and things and flattens the whole composition into this dump. So we come to the question of why Ray used silhouettes as this kind of sounding board or this prime vehicle for free association throughout so many of these collages. I posit that silhouettes are uniquely physical and uniquely embodied, which relates to their romantic and violent history, which I just discussed, and kind of fuels Johnson's interest in using them to inspire creation. Relating to Johnson's interest in sadomasochism and the SM scene and anonymous sex, which is like a whole other presentation that I would love to give, silhouettes present a method of portraiture which is highly embodied yet also anonymous. So we're talking about the tension between identifying and anonymizing. They are highly embodied on the part of the sitter and the artist. You think about Ray literally leaning in close and tracing someone's physical form, yet, as I said before, they're also anonymizing, completely flattening someone into this featureless void. So in this way, the silhouettes relate to a sense of longing for something really paradoxical, which is something both personal and anonymous, which has long formed a part of queer counterculture. Here's the example again of him tracing so that you can see that really embodied process. And here's an example of the inclusion of this kind of paradoxical longing in queer counterculture. This is a Tumblr post where someone has made a joke here. So it reads, "The absence of something is also as presence." And then the reply from the same poster says, "Why does everyone keep tagging this post as Yuri?" So the joke here is that Yuri is like this trope-laden Japanese media genre that features lesbian relationships. And the joke is that the characters spend so much time longing for each other that the tension, the dramatic tension, actually revolves around the potential lesbian sex that's not happening. It's all about the potentiality. And so I thought this kind of summed up this feeling really well, this sense of queer longing that happens in real life as well as in media and fiction. And then I think that this sense of queer longing also arises from something that Jose Esteban Munoz identifies as the queer utopian impulse. So the longing not just for some kind of human connection in the present, but for connections across time and things that might give rise to different queer ways of living and doing. And so in Ray Johnson's silhouettes, the absence of the silhouetted bodies is also their continuing presence. It's a paradox. The individual's physical absence, but perpetual signification inspires us to think about those connections that were, that could be, and that could have been. And this is the crux of the anythingness that the silhouettes embody, the conversion of the empty whole into a proliferation of meanings. So if we think about these silhouettes as wholes, which Johnson has filled with personal effects, we can kind of think of them, personal effects, social references, and everyday imagery. We can view them through this kind of methodology of free association and queer relationality. They're somewhat like a time capsule capturing this specific cross-section of the American art world between the 1950s and the 1990s. But in another sense, they're kind of always in motion, always inspiring our minds along these paths of association. And this is exactly the kind of productive paradox that Jose Esteban Munoz talks about in his book and identifies as distinctly queer and distinctly utopian. So finally, to really demonstrate this concept of wholes, I want to bring it out of the collage era and using these incredible photographs. These were exhibited by the Morgan Library and Museum in an exhibition called Please Send to Real Life. And so I'm actually borrowing these pairings from that exhibition. So many thanks to the incredible curatorial work there that allows me a platform jumping off to try to kind of compare these two epochs to try to unify this theory of nothingness and anythingness and silhouettes as wholes. So in these two examples, on the left, we have a kind of emblematic Ray Johnson collage using Silhouette University silhouettes. This is William Burroughs, and then I think that there might be a second silhouetted individual, but I think the second silhouette is actually Tab Hunter. Yeah, I think he actually did a silhouette of Tab Hunter. And so the joke here, there's many jokes, but among all of this included ephemera, there's like a drawing of underwear and like there's a snake. And then part of the joke here is, of course, the wordplay between Will or Bill and then tab, because a bill is a synonym for a tab. And so this is a kind of collage that we can read through this methodology of free association and then moving into queer relationality as this kind of cross section of the art world or of the culture of the time. Maybe figuring into that framework of pop art that Ray is sometimes included with. Moving on to the image on the right, though, this is extremely different. So this is from the body of color photography that he created in the kind of last 3 years before his death. And compared to the collages, these photographs are extremely ephemeral and even casual, and they don't exhibit this same kind of eerie sense of precision and control and reworking again. Instead, you almost imagine Ray Johnson just like breezing by and like putting all the things together and then snapping the photo. So some details about this photo, borrowed from the Morgan Library Museum's analysis. They think the joke here is that the kingfisher's bill is on Bill's bill. So it's like Bill's bill becoming the bill of a bill. And as far as we can see, that's the only kind of joke or wordplay contained within the image. But as we know from the framework of free association, the kind of things we can imagine, what we can take out of the work doesn't end there. There's really interesting formal qualities to this photo. So the silhouette, actually, if you look closely itself, first of all, is evidence that these pieces were thrown down in a really ephemeral and casual way. They might not even be pasted down at all. It might just be the kingfisher that's holding the silhouette down onto the piece of cardboard in the, I imagine this is a parking lot because of the stripe. And so, of course, extremely different from what we see in the collage. And second of all, the silhouette, which is traced from a shadow and which can be seen as a shadow itself, is actually casting a shadow of its own, which is fascinating in its own right. And so we get all of these associations. We don't just stop with, Bill's a bill, and that's all I have to say. Instead, we can think about William Burroughs as the inventor of the literary cut-up, as an icon of queer postmodernist writing, and the kind of associations there with him and Ray Johnson. And we actually find that even though the free association is significantly pared down, it's actually the same idea behind these new photographs. It's taking a small wordplay, a small association, and building it out into something that can be fascinating and that can be kind of draw you into the whole of the silhouette. So I want to just show one last pairing. I think I'm pretty good on time here. I want to show one last pairing to really demonstrate the resonance of silhouettes as wholes. This is a work that Johnson created using his own profile silhouette. And so Morgan Library and Museum thinks that this might be referencing Hazel Larson Archer's famous photograph of the back of Ray Johnson's head with his kind of short crop of swirling hair. But there's many other things we could read into this image. So I think that maybe when Ray was taking this photo, maybe he was like stumped, and that's the meaning of the stump being inside his head. Or maybe the photo was meant to stump us. There's also the really kind of interesting and eerie resonance of this photo on the beach and Ray Johnson's eventual death on a beach similarly. And so this photo is really just extremely ephemeral, casual, so different from the collages, but using that potentiality of the silhouette, we actually see the same transformation of meaning through free association, transformation of nothingness into anythingness. So the kind of potentiality of the silhouette is really embodied also if you think about the moments right before this photograph. So you think about Ray Johnson walking down the beach, literally removing himself, having removed himself from the piece of paper. And suddenly this piece of paper is a potentiality. He can set it down anywhere and it suddenly becomes a new image. Suddenly it has a new meaning. And so it's not just that the silhouette becomes, the whole becomes filled, or the whole becomes filled with meaning as soon as it's set down, but really the silhouette, even when it's empty, has that characteristic of potentiality all along. And so for me, that is the true power of the silhouette, given its unique qualities of not just becoming this kind of abstract element of negative space, but actually representing a person as this unique identifier, and then the way that you can fill it in this kind of extremely unique and resonant way. So to wrap up about Johnson's nothings, this is a quote from Munoz. He describes them as saying a nothing is a utopian act insofar as it acknowledges a lack that is normalized as reality and attempts to work with and through nothingness and ephemerality. It is both a critique and an additive or reparative gesture. So I argue that we can see silhouettes within Ray Johnson's work as a similar kind of gesture. The stripped down ephemeral compositions here are still making use of this playful exchange through free association, containing puns and references and elements that are meant to draw us in. And in these compositions, the silhouettes actually carry such potentiality because of their emptiness. And in their emptiness, they beg to be filled with meaning. And I view this perpetual tension between nothingness and anythingness, emptiness and fullness as a crucial aspect of Johnson's work, completely wrapped up with queer longing and queer relationality. So silhouettes bring to the table their paradoxes of identity and anonymity and their history of absence and presence and identification and anonymity, and it kind of makes them the perfect tool to express this paradox. So thank you all very much. I hope this has shed some light on silhouettes, if you were wondering what the heck those mean. And I'm really excited to work more with this theory in the future and hopefully get to look at a lot more silhouettes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kira. That was fantastic. I think this is actually, Ellen, you raised a really neat point of just looking at that last slide you showed us, Kira, of the relationship to the matière. And I don't know, maybe if both you and Alex want to just respond to that or comment on that, that'd be great to hear more thoughts. But thanks for that, Ellen.
I'll just say, absolutely. I think I had that thought maybe when we had the conference and I was like furiously writing. It was my first time hearing Kira's presentation. So I was like furiously writing all of the notes that Kira had. Wonderful presentation, second time around. I loved all the new additions, Kira. It was great. But yes, I mean, this interest in materiality that is connected through Johnson's very ephemeral, very like quick, like not complicated, but often like quantifiably proliferating sort of processes, I think absolutely can be drawn back to the matière. And I would argue it definitely explicitly does, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I want to input a little idea also that I discuss in my thesis, which is this the free association as this kind of psychological mode of chance and like finding chance and freedom, but without actually giving in to the chance of like physics or science. And so I think this is kind of like a divide in the art world at the time. And like John Cage is like, let's use numbers and like, let's predict things with numbers and let's like take the artist out of it. And I do not think Ray is interested in that. I mean, that's my opinion, but I think that he gets at it in a different way. And I think that is kind of emblematic in the matière studies, because it's not like, oh, we'll like throw a leaf on a page and see what the leaf
right.
is. It's actually all about your human mind inputting the effort and the design sensibilities and your personality and identity into the work and creating something completely new out of the materials. And so I think that's exactly, as you discussed in your talk, Alex, something that Johnson takes from the Alberses out into his life forever and ever and ever, and becomes really, really central to him. So
yeah, definitely. I'll just say one more thing on that note of chance. I think critically, during Johnson's time at BMC and shortly after, I think he is negotiating all of those elements of chance. Like, do I learn from John Cage? Do I learn from Albers? Like, do I put in chance at all? And I think you're absolutely right. I think through Albers, Johnson basically takes the mode of chance only when the work leaves his hands, right? I mean, in some way, it becomes changed by others. It becomes changed through the environments he's walking through. But when he's there, when he's in the mode of working, no chance. You know what I mean? Like, no chance. It's all him, and it's all very intentional. I think that's a very fine nuance. Like, good point.
And even when I was gonna say, even when he leaves it up to chance, sometimes he gets mad when it doesn't go his way. So yeah, totally.
I think too, I mean, I don't know if you all have felt this, but when you get into that flow mode and just kind of time dissolves around you, and I feel Ray is one of those artists who very much works in the flow mode, so like one thing leads to another, and right, he's kind of in his space and in his world and in his head, but kind of following these things through. But then I think, right, like this idea that then everyone also brings all of their stuff with them to whatever he then also lets go, and so then and then even just that Lorna held on to Ray's letters for all of her life is an element of chance, but they're also saved because she did. So we could just also talk forever about this, but I think it's just so interesting of how all of this kind of comes up. And I think even just there's an intentionality of putting that kingfisher on William S. Burroughs' silhouette, but also that kingfisher could be anything. Like, he could have chosen so many things instead of the kingfisher. So there's both intentionality, but there's also, since it's not pasted down, he could pick it up and replace it with something in the future, which I think so much speaks to, how you're both talking about and queer futurity and queer relationality and all of this. But I'm so grateful to you both for kind of taking this more recent theory, because this is, I think, the theory that we've been waiting for to be ready to discussed in these terms and in these frameworks. So, or I have been. So.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? To Ellen, if you have anything that you'd want to say, just since you think about Ray a lot, and you have some new younger scholars who have been reading your work and thinking about Ray too. Oh, you're
Sorry.
muted. Okay.
Yeah. So I was just typing both really, really rich and suggestive presentations, and I can see all different ways they can go. These are also things that both of the things you talk about are things I talk about in the book. I talk about the Matière studies as very important for his directions. And I think in the way you're talking about it now, it makes me think, I mean, the geometric formalism that Ray learned from Albers and that he never, stopped using was a kind of, again, a kind of trap for him. He got so stuck with that in the painting that he gave up early on. But the Matière studies were never supposed to be permanent. And that's very free. The idea that you can just lay something down, it's beautiful, it's photographed, which is also part of Ray's thing.
That's a good point.
But then it doesn't last. But the other thing that really, here's a direct connection between Kira's and Alex's things. The Matière studies were supposed to be about the hand, the haptic. This is something that Albers writes about. He wanted, and Ray writes about this too in his letters, that Matière is about touch, handling things, and giving a sense of the texture of things even through the visual. And then Ray begins to use hands very early on in the work. And I think I say in the book that the cover he did for William Carlos Williams in The American Grain is a Matière study. He lays the hand on texture things and photographs that various different ways. Mm-hmm. So, and then he begins, of course, before he does the silhouettes of faces, he does the silhouettes of hands, and that moves toward so there's this kind of direct set of links about the body and then the absence of the body. You know, the sort of the way in which sight removes you from the body, but he wants to bring you back to the body in this loop. Sorry, that's a lot, but made me think of all that listening to you guys.
So good.
You know what? Can I, so I'm just gonna, if you want to respond, of course you can. I don't know if this will show up, but Ellen, just the way you were talking about how Ray gets trapped in the painting, but this is Latter World, which was in Bill Wilson's collection. My guess is it's now in the Art Institute's collection. But look at the silhouette in here, Kira. So, like, again, I think, like, and then it even has this like moon-like thing too. So also someone should totally trace the moons throughout Ray's work, but that's okay.
Yeah, no, theory. I haven't read, this is another theory I have, but at the time that Johnson was doing a lot of these, you know, geometric formalist paintings, he was sending, so like if we're thinking like maybe like 1949 to like the early 50s or whatever, he was sending all these letters to Francis X. Profumo, and in them he's describing all of the paintings that he's doing, and there's a mention of what is it, 3 moons or something. Leopold at the time is also working on like moon sculptures or something of that nature. Leopold is working on the subject of the moon, and I really think that there's some sort of cross connection there, but for another paper maybe.
But I think that's a great continuation. Like if you wanted to, like, you know, whatever, make a book of what you're talking about of Ray's letters, Alex, like to bring Francis and Richard in there, because Francis was friends with both of them. And then Ray, like to think there's that kind of triangulation going on, you know, or that including Richard, even though he's kind of unsaid, but through the imagery. Interesting. That'd be great. Anyone else have questions or comments or things to ask?
Can I raise my hand? Hi, I'm Mark Block. I was a friend of Ray's, and I just wanted to say that one time he drew my hand. I went to dinner with him and Robert Delford Brown and his wife, Rhett Brown. And one of the things he did was sit us all down and drew our hands after we had dinner. And he made like, it was basically a silhouette of my hand. And I have no idea whatever happened to those. And I really want to know. I don't know if you have seen those at the estate, Ellen. But I think they must exist perhaps. But they were like the silhouettes. And my understanding at the time was that they were like a series, like the silhouettes. Oh, I did the silhouettes, those are done, now I'm doing hands. I think he might have even referred to it that way. But anyway, so that was a whole thing, and I know he did a lot of people's hands, and he did mine, and I'd love to see it. And I guess as long as we're on the topic, I'll switch topics, but since I have the mic, I'll just say quickly for everyone, but for Kira, I wanted to show you this exciting thing was that in 94, I think, I got married, and we stopped it and went out to the end of Long Island for my honeymoon, and on the way back, we stopped at Ray's house. So it was the only time I ever went to his house. I used to talk to him on the phone all the time, and I have a lot of letters from him. But we went to his house. So here's me standing on the I don't know if you can see that, but standing on his back porch. He didn't answer the door. It was a really hot day, and he said, oh, I was in my surrealist nightmare with the air conditioning on, so I didn't hear anyone knocking at the door, which I didn't believe for a second. I know he would have heard me knocking on the door if he was in there, but he probably didn't want to answer the door. But anyway, so that's me standing on his back door, on his back porch, okay? And then, I could go on and on about that, but a few weeks later, he sent me, or a couple days later, I guess, he sent me this, let me see, this is a Xerox, a silhouette of me standing on his back door. So he made a silhouette, and this was towards the end of his life when he was dying, and he used to taunt me because he knew I wanted to be in his bunny lists, and I wanted to be in everything that he did, and so he purposely left me out of it because he didn't want to talk about longing. He knew about my longing, and he really understood my longing. And so he purposely left me out of a lot of things. So when he said this, he was like, he didn't say, you know, cream your jeans or anything, but it was like that type of vibe, like, you are really gonna love this, because he knew that I would be very excited to get this silhouette. And then what he did was on my, oh, and I'm wearing a baseball cap, and this is not a Trump hat, by the way. I wanted you to see, this is my Duchampian hat. That's my hat. I made that. But anyway, he put this, so I was wearing a baseball hat, and he put on my chest this circle, which is very much like the Black Mountains college logo from the early days. And he had this,
Yeah, very much.
this logo on there on my chest, which says Ray Johnson Catalog Raisonné. So he was basically saying, I mean, I don't know if this is what he meant, but he was sort of taunting, not taunting me, the opposite. It's like, after all the taunting, he's like, you're gonna love this. And then he's like, it could be, it's like he was saying, here's the cover of my catalog raisonné, which will feature you with a big Ray Johnson catalog raisonné on your chest, you know. So anyway, it was a silhouette, and I was just so honored to be on that silhouette. And then what happened was we started sending it back and forth to each other, and he sent me a picture of the silhouette on his back porch in the position where I had been standing, and he called it the incredible shrinking man, because I kept getting smaller and smaller as both of us were making copies, and he was taking them outside and putting them on the porch. So anyway, that's one little story, and I could say more, but I'll leave it there. And I just want to say I loved both of your talks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. That's great.
Thank
Thanks so much for
you.
sharing.
I love that story.
I'm curious about Mark saying that he was visiting him while he was dying. Now, this is something I've not heard about, that he had some sort of illness at that time.
No. I didn't say that. Sorry for any misconception. It's just that it was towards his death. It was the summer before he died. So he was doing a lot of really sweet things during that time. Like one time I said something like, I don't remember. I used to write down all our phone calls, and he knew I was taking notes on everything, and it really bugged him. He's like, are you writing this down? And I was like, yeah. And he was annoyed. But at one point I might have said something to him like, are you annoyed, Ray? And he was like, oh no, I'm very fond of you, Mark. You know, and he said that to lots of people, like really sweet things in the last year of his life, just to indicate his appreciation of people and closeness and real loving. He was such a loving person, but he could also, okay, let me say this on the topic of free association, like he was just nothing if not free associating all the time. Our phone calls were one bit of free association in, you know, for an hour, nonstop free association. It could go anywhere. But what I wanted to say is that, and we also talked about Taoism a lot, which is I think where the nothingness came from, and the word Tao hasn't been mentioned, so I want to really stress that you know, Wu Wei is an expression in Chinese that means, you know, do nothing but leave nothing left undone, and I think that's exactly who Ray was. So I think that free association and then the nothing are two things that are really important about him. But then I was thinking there's a third thing, which is this love that he had and this earnestness. Like I when I interview people about Ray, I always ask, so what was he like when he was real with you? Because there would come a time when all that free association and that playfulness would fall away, and he would just suddenly become extremely real and just be like any other, well, maybe not like any other person, but you know, like any other person, and be real and have a conversation. And in those moments, he would express a fondness, you know, whatever, or he would like if you asked him something, a lot of times he would just say nothing or no thing or boring, you know, and he wouldn't answer a question, but occasionally he would just totally answer your question. And it was such a lovely moment, because it wasn't every time, but occasionally he would just feel like, I'm going to answer this one, you know, I will take that question. But anyway, thank you. I'll shut up.
Oh, it's good. It's good to hear your comments. Thank you.
Yeah,
Carrie,
but the thing
just...
about the thing about the death, just to be clear, so I was just referring to that it was close to the end of his life, and in that last year, a lot of interesting things happened, and that, you know, I was taken by surprise by his death, like everyone else.
Okay.
Yeah, good question, Carrie, because you never know when we unearth something new about Ray in this. So, but Carrie, what is your response to your phone calls from Ray compared to how Mark just described his?
I agree. I think he was kind of in performance mode all the time that I've met him. And I'm just curious about how Ray would take this idea of fame and people talking about him and analyzing his works, because he was very funny. He had like a double-sided approach to all this, like where he hated, you know, his own exhibitions, or, you know, the idea of having an exhibit would like exhaust him. He'd love it and he'd hate it, or he would not go, or he would sometimes just leave something there in the corner of a room, or, you know, and then the other thing is, like, he would call me up to say, I'm in the Andy Warhol diary on page blah, 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 look me up, and hang up. You know, he would do these things to kind of um, announce his presence in the world, you know, like, I'm not invisible. Or, Carrie, when am I getting a show at Cranbrook? What can you help me? You know, call the director, call Roy or whatever, you know, I've got this great idea for it. And then, you know, and you try to follow through, but then, you know, he would cut it off. He would also kind of exhaust it and sabotage his own you know, thing. But I just think that he did want this attention in a way. And I think it's interesting that we're doing this online, which has a kind of a, you know, this parallel to the letters, you know, and the, you know, sending out letters in the world. And so I think it's kind of a neat parallel.
Well, I also love how the Zoom format kind of makes us like the seating charts he made. You know, like we have a grid of people and their heads and our names are there. And it's like this digital version of the seating charts that he made decades ago. Ellen did say that the first mention of nothingness that she found in one of Ray's letters to Lorna Blaine Helper. But he talks about Asawa's use of the concept in class, but she had to run. So, but
I was just going to add on to that with this this concept of his performativity, his being this, you know, always in a persona or whatever. I think it's one of the reasons why these early letters to Helper are so beautiful and so fascinating, is that there really isn't a performative character in them. It's a student. It's Ray Johnson as a student at BMC, working through influences, working through, oh, where am I going with this painting? What am I doing with this design? Who are my friends who are in my study right now? Like, whose study am I taking over next semester? You know, he's really discussing like all of the on the ground sort of like physical realities of being at BMC, and he's doing it in this like just extraordinarily funny and like bright sort of format with these handmade letters. So I just think they're quite magical and like tell this little snippet of Ray's story that kind of is otherwise like, you know, so Ray, right?
Never seen those construction paper collages before. They're really wonderful that they just are sealed with tape, and those were cool. And I love the fact you're unearthing these letters. And just to reinforce what Julie said about maybe putting some sort of catalog together of these letters would be great between the artists. And
absolutely.
I think one thing that I see as a connection. Oh, I see Sophia has her hand up, but I just wanted to just say this, and just like if we're trying to draw a connection between Alex's talks and Kira's talk tonight, which Ellen already did one, but I see both too, and I think other people have discussed this, so I don't think it's an epiphany, but just to say it aloud for this group, is like the envelope is a container for Ray. And then I think the way Kira talks about the silhouettes, they're also this container for whatever Ray puts in them or like happens across in the world. And so I think too, the containerness of both are kind of fun to think about side by side. And then I think Ray's silhouettes of himself that Kira, you should one, but where it's his own silhouette and he sends it to people. And Kira, you were showing the one of James Rosenquist sent back. But that's almost like Ray being like, who am I to you? Or if I give you my silhouette, what do you put in it? That I think also is just this interesting continuation of this conversation. But Carrie, do you know how we let Sophia ask a question? Or can you just unmute, Sophia? Great.
I think I can just unmute. Hi, sorry, it's been a while since I've used Zoom. I just want to say thanks to Kira and Alex. It was lovely to hear you speak. I'm sorry I wasn't able to make it out to the conference this year. I had some family stuff come up. But my name is Sophia. I am the Ray Johnson cataloger at the Art Institute of Chicago. I work directly with the Bill Wilson collection of Ray Johnson. It's lovely to be here and see all your faces. I had a question for the both of you, but particularly for Kira. I read your submission to the Black Mountain College Journal. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I also just want to point out we were living kind of weirdly parallel lives where we were both from Massachusetts, graduated around the same time, went to very similar schools, ended up in very similar fields in different places. Anyway, besides the point. My question is, you use this phrase in your work that I would love to hear your explanation of. You talk about Ray sort of queering normative modes of being, queering the body. I just wanted to ask, like, what does queering mean to you, if you could extrapolate on that term? Alex, I'd love to hear what you have to say as well. I feel like it's a term that I've come across in my own sort of forays into queer theory and art historical theory, but I haven't really nailed down a great definition of. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as it relates to Ray. Also, just circling back, Julie can confirm Art Institute of Chicago does have Latter's World.
I can start with that. Thank you so much, Sophia, for that question. I think that for me, queering, or like this kind of usage of the term, really relates back to this concept of queer formalism and the push or kind of modality in the field of queer studies to be able to look at something that as queer, or as something that is kind of changing or speculating this really different way of living that is, of course, tied back to bodily practices, sexual practices, cultural practices that have commonalities with like real living queer communities of the past and present and future, but really as a formal analysis or a conceptual analysis of something that is projecting a different way, a completely different way of thinking about the world, that has in common this utopian, and I use utopian not in the sense of like everything's perfect, but as the like Munosian kind of sense of imagining a different way that the body could be, imagining that a different way that we could interact as humans, and extrapolating that term not just to include LGBTQ countercultures, but to include this whole field of thinking. And that is a push in the field of queer theory, because it's really limiting to be able to say, oh, well, I'm going to study only what LGBT people do, because it's like people don't even, identity is so completely fluid, and you can never know someone else's internal world, and we don't even know our own internal worlds. And so it's this really freeing, I mean, I'm sure you know all this, but anyway, that's what it really means to me, is this way of seeing the body in a way that's completely different from our normative way of seeing the body. And I would love to one day work body without organs into this kind of theory, and just this concept of not seeing the body as this like machine that we have to control, like we have to control like what we eat, and we have to control like our weight, and we have to control our like movement, but as this like expansive thing that we live inside, and it could be segmented into these parts and silhouettes and represented in these crazy ways. And I see a lot of imagery in Johnson's work that is that comes from the body, and that's a little bit from what Ellen was talking about. And so that's why I use the term queering the body. And I think it's really hard to explain to people sometimes, because I see like a snake and people are like, how is this queering the body? And I'm like, to me, that snake is like an intestine or something, and that's the way that you can think about it in a completely different way from expand your mind to think about it that way. So I hope that answer was somewhat coherent. I'll pass it off to Alex.
Yeah. Okay. I love this question. And I love Kira's answer because it was so much more about the body than how I'm going to answer it. And I'll start off by saying that I think there are lots of ways it's still being worked out, I think, as a term completely. Like in an art historical context, I think they're absolutely like it's up in the air, and I think it should stay up in the air. But one way that at least I think about it in terms of thinking about how Johnson is responding to Albers, and I think I say explicitly in my thesis and maybe in my conference that Johnson is not queering Albers, quote unquote. That's just my reading, but I think you could play it into a framework that is actually Johnson queering Albers, and I think it would look something like this. So if you have Albers, for instance, his homage to the Square series, right? And that was a very, like, I think of prime modernist work. Like we're gonna move the art object outside of physical interaction. It's no longer functional. It's something that we are going to observe and learn from. It's highly formal. However, in the same way, and I think there's a slight paradox in homage to the Square, it very much relates to the body, and it very much relates to a human having to be there to account for the relativity of color, right? Now, I think that Johnson queers, in a sense, Albers' homage to the Square series in his early letters by taking components of the color study, by laying down different sheets of paper next to each other in order to analyze color's relative nature. But at the same time, he's bringing that lesson outside the strict realm of the art world, outside of the museum walls, and into people's hands. So it becomes like this exploration of hapticity, of tactileness, and of engaging people directly, right? So in that way, I think that's like a very clear way that we could say that Johnson is queering Albers' methods. But I would argue that it's a more nuanced situation, and Albers himself is also still like using elements of queerness in his work. So it's not that clean, but that's one way that I like thinking about it. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very illuminating. I really appreciate that. And just super appreciate your work. Just broadly, as a queer person in the world of Ray Johnson, it's great to see other people writing it down, fighting the good fight. Also loving to see all the Western Mass connections in the chat. I'm from Cambridge originally, but spent a lot of time in Western Mass at Smith.
Yeah, maybe I was going to put it in the chat, but it'll come off different in the chat. And so like maybe like Massachusetts is like for Ray Johnson books and like the Bermuda Triangle or something, but then somehow we all get out of the triangle, and then I don't know, I was in the whatever. Anyways, I'll just leave it there. But yeah, I think this is like, because when I was actually in grad school at UMass Amherst in Western Mass, here we go, I can bring it back. But someone gave me Jose Esteban Munoz's book, and I was writing about Ray's Nothings and Bill Wilson's photographs of Ray's Nothings, and how it doesn't become nothing. And so like I'm wrestling with it in my own ways, in my own terms, but I'm not a queer person. And so I think what I was so also, someone who is not Muslim can also study Islamic art. So that's, of course, that's not a limiting factor in any means, but I couldn't read it through that lens. And so I think, Kira, what I also am grateful for you for is you taking up that book that someone gave to me long ago, but making sense of it, but also making sense of your own framework, and I think also too, there's a time where things make sense more, or you get more pieces of the puzzle to put together in a different time. But also we're all keeping those Ray Johnson puzzle pieces for whoever comes along, and of definitely you included, Sophia, and Caitlin over at the Art Institute, for who, and Bill Wilson, number one, but we're keeping these puzzle pieces for whoever can put them together in an illuminating way, either now or in the future. So.
Can I just say very quickly, just food for thought, and I would love if anyone knows anything about this. I just really, as much as I love what you guys said, and I love all the books and texts about Ray and his queerness, and I'm writing my own book about Ray, and I'm also a straight person, as far as I know. Seriously, so I want to get it right. So I really pay attention, and I always talk to people about this. But my question is, I guess it's a question, is just what Ray would have thought about this. He was very private about his life. In some ways, he was so out. In other ways, he was very private and very, I don't know, whatever. I don't want to go into too much detail, but he was like an old school gay man. And so I just wonder what he would make of all the stuff that's going on now, and what I should make of it through that lens, because I knew him and we talked about body crazy, kinky, weird shit all the time. And my thing about Ray is that he was very naughty. So yes, he was queer, but he just seemed like I always think of Frank Zappa. Like, here are these two brilliant guys, Ray Johnson and Frank Zappa. Why do they both love jokes about like pee pee and poo poo? And you know what I mean? Like, they were just so intelligent and so articulate, and at the same time they just loved anything naughty, and he would love to engage with me in any number of ways about that stuff, like for hours, really. But my question is, like, what would he think of it, and what would he I don't know, what do you guys think? What I just want to raise that question, that it makes me crazy. Like, I'm reading Miriam's book now, which is really hard for me to get through, because I'm reading it like every sentence 3 times, trying to like really get it, and it's quite a intense book. I just wonder, what would Ray think about it, number one, and number two, what should we think about it? Does it matter? Like, we talk about identity, we don't know our I think Kira said we don't know our own identity. So, like, does Ray's identity belong to Ray? I mean, it did before, but does it now? And what's going to happen? So I just, you guys, you pure scholars, I'm an artist and a scholar, but you pure scholars, like, take the ball and run with it. So I find it fascinating. And I want to just introduce that question because it comes up a lot for me. Thank you.
I definitely want to reply to this, but Alex or Kira, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll just say, first of all, I'm also an artist turned art historian. So
Me
I would
too.
say that,
Same.
yeah. And I would say that my argument is definitely trying to confront this question. I mean, like I said, there's a lot of scholarship out there right now that is directly addressing Ray's queerness, and more specifically, addressing qualities of Ray's queerness that are directly related to his sexuality, right? And I think that what I'm trying to do in my argument in terms of Johnson's queer formalism is unpack how his queerness is also entangled in his formal methods and in his lessons from BMC, and could possibly predate or be continuous with some of these like queer sexuality considerations. I think it's very entwined with Ray, for sure. And certainly as his career progressed, these things were entwined. Whether or not he would have liked it is a question that none of us will ever know. Definitely. Yeah, but Kira, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to also jump in and say, I think that, Benjamin Kahn has this great essay, or it's like a kind of essay with Bill Wilson about a recollection of how Ray never wanted to define himself, right? Like, he was this old school gay man, but also he wasn't ever saying that, or if he was saying it, he was interested in all these other naughty things, and there were many women that were close to him. And so, like, something that's, I think, really special about the term queer is that it brings us away, and in the community today is often a reaction to this the kind of I don't know, the kind of integration of LGBTQ into what is, the old society. And what about new society? What about art? What about changing the world and creating new things? And I think that's power that the word queer has to do. And I mean, controversial statement, do you even need to be homosexual to be queer? I mean, well, you certainly don't need to be, because you could be trans and then you could be not a homosexual and then you could be queer. But I mean, even expanding out of this, right? What does the term queer mean? What can it stand to one day encompass? And if it encompasses so much, would it eventually lose meaning? But maybe we want a world where the word queer can encompass almost anyone. Maybe that would be a beautiful world, right? I don't know. These are things that maybe Jose Esteban Munoz would say or think about. But then for me, there's also, on the flip side, I always try to kind of think in my mind and bring this term queer back to the sexuality and the naughtiness, and to keep queerness naughty. Because this is very important to me. I won't say more, but in my personal life. And I think that sometimes, with all the beauty that the term queer has to bring us away from, gay people have to mimic the heterosexual nuclear family, all the power that it has in that direction. Sometimes it also becomes, and we're all genderless beings, and we live in a world without sex, and things are just art, and it's like, we got to keep queer naughty, you know what I mean? And so I hope that Ray would appreciate that sentiment. And I think there are many scholars, hopefully most of them, in the queer theory world, who are working in that element. And that's crucial to me as a queer person and as a trans person, especially as a trans person whose identity is very connected to my medical experience as a trans person and the essential character of the medical transition for trans people, that trans people have essentially created a century-long collaboration with doctors to achieve and create this new queer way of living through surgery, and that's queering the body, is what I think. But that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, that's sort of my response. I hope that Ray might like the term queer and how it's growing and how it's changing. And in a lot of ways, I think that word is trying to go back in time and harken back to this time pre-Stonewall and with the nebulousness that there was there, and to try to bring that back because we live in this very identity focused world where you have to present yourself in this way, you know, in your screen in a certain way. So yeah.
Well, I think where this conversation led my mind to go is when I think here, let me just say this because okay, oh my gosh, I have to focus because I have two things I want to say at the exact same time. First response was, I think after both Kira and Alex's presentations, we got into this, you know, we are now in a more expansive world than, you know, in Ray's time, it was much more binary. And I think now we are in, and definitely we're fighting for it, but we're definitely in a non-binary world. And Ray was not interested in binaries. He was interested in the both and I've written about this in the past, but very much that Duchamp door that is both open and closed, and it can never be open or closed, you know, and so it's on the hinge. And so I think, you know, we were just talking after their first presentations that I was in the room for of, you know, a Ray Johnson world is a both and world. It's not an either or world. But second, I think when Alex, you were talking about Joseph's color studies and even just how you were putting the paper down, I imagined how like Ray is, you know, having his, well, we don't know Ray's prehistory before Richard Leopold so much, even though there's definitely things you could put together with earlier documents and whatnot to speculate, I would say, about. And Bill Wilson had his ideas. But, you know, Ray is with Richard Leopold, and then who knows he's with Richard Leopold and who doesn't, makes it so he's like those color changing papers. So Ray is maybe the pink paper. Let's just, because we have that beautiful pink paper image from your presentation. Ray is the pink paper, and when you put him next to the yellow paper, he shines in one way, and Richard Leopold is the yellow paper. But then if you put him next to his older friend, green, let's say Elaine Urbane, you know, then he's also Ray and Elaine. And so that fluid and that shiftiness that I think really also, I wonder what went on in Ray's young mind of like reading into those bigger life meanings of art by thinking how color is relative and how colors change depending on what colors you put next to each other. I think very much he believed, and I believe, and I think many of us believe, that people are relative, and you also change depending on what person you're next to, and a collage changes depending on what material you put next to it. So so much rich territory that we could also keep talking about. I think there's a few more comments, but yeah, Carrie, what do you want to interject here?
I was just going to mention that what I saw in sexuality in Ray's work was all the campiness, which I think it's a real powerful thing that happened like around the early 60s, late 50s. There was this sudden kind of, you know, questioning and sort of subversion of Hollywood, kind of flipping it on its head. And there, it's all through Ray's celebrity choices, you know, in his Bunny series and the portraits, and who he chose to kind of celebrate in a way. And it was very, I mean, I kind of got to Ray through Jack Smith, who I was like really kind of onto in high school and communicated with, and that was like an important introduction to Ray's world. So it was very much in the air, this camp, and Susan Sontag's whole, you know, her whole notes on camp kind of exploded this in the early 60s. And so yeah, it's a great essay, and you know, should read it. And that was kind of what got me more into that world.
Well, and also too, that's an excellent point, and we don't want to also lose sight of that within all these kind of newer theories, because that also is coming out in the time Ray's living for sure. And I think both Warhol and Ray work in that camp way, where Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns take the silent path, or that really that quieter path. But I think also too, just to mention in this group for anyone who doesn't know it, Norman Solomon was on the set of Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures and made photographs. And Ray met Norman through Bill Wilson, and there's Black Mountain College connections too. So.
I always think of the Billy Name photograph that Ray's in, where he's like standing behind Warhol and he's doing the sound. And Ray introduced me to Billy Name, and Ray would say, "Yeah, that's the image." He goes, "Look, I'm holding up Andy's butt." It was like, what? I'm holding up his ass. So in a way, like him saying that about him holding up Ray, it was like, or Andy, it was kind of like, but he's really holding a microphone. But it was like, I was helping Ray, or I was helping Andy. I was giving him something. He got something from me to kind of interesting.
When I used to talk to Ray, I didn't know who Jack Smith was, and he always laughed when he mentioned Jack Smith. And when I finally found out who Jack Smith was, like a lot, not just his movies, but then when I saw an exhibition that they had at Artist Space in New York that was fantastic. I wrote about it in the Brooklyn Rail, actually. But I just got it. It was like, oh, this is why he always laughed. Like he thought Jack Smith was funny, So you talk about camp. I think Ray and Jack Smith were like inventing camp, and it's hilarious and it is naughty. It's not. I have to say to a bunch of scholars, he always used to say to me, "Ray, what'd you think of this article?" Boring. So we have to remember don't get too boring, folks. Keep it interesting. He wanted things to be fun.
Carrie and I only invite the interesting folks to this. So no.
Yeah. No, this is good. I don't know if anyone has any last minute comments, but we should.
I think Sophia's got her hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I just as to like Ray's Ray Johnson in scholarship and then the familiarity that people find, we've all been referring to Ray as Ray and not Johnson. I've been in contact with actually, Mark may be able to speak to this too. I've been talking to one of Ray's friends sort of later in his life, Bill Dobbs, who you scholars of queer history might recognize as a founding member of ACT UP. One of these folks who was very much out and proud, and talking to him about Ray Johnson's scholarship more broadly, he was talking about, wanting to state very explicitly that Ray was a person to him as much as he is a figure in art history. He was, this is someone who he lost, and it's the way we talk about Ray and his queerness is we approach it in a very scholarly way, but I think we have to also consider the fact that Ray was a person as much as he was a fantastic artist. And I mean, the speculation that we can have is purely speculation. Not all of us are as lucky as the folks in this call who were actually friends of Ray. But yeah, I mean, just talking to Bill really opened my eyes to that sort of world of like Ray's privateness as a person and the sort of Ray's work being so invitational to especially young queer people like myself and to other folks in the call. It makes me feel very familiar with him, but the sort of boundaries that we have to understand as scholars, I'm positing myself as a scholar feels very putting myself in bigger shoes than I have, but talking about Ray as a queer figure and as also just a person in people's lives,
Well, and I think maybe this is a great note to end on, Sophia. I think Bill Wilson, was always trying, he knew Ray and he knew Ray so well, or, if anyone could know Ray, he knew Ray in an intense a way. And I think Bill would always love when he got someone else's correspondence with Ray, because he would just see a whole different side. And he's like, in this one, there's all this swearing, or, they're always talking about money with this person. And, like Bill was also trying to always understand Ray even more, but also knew that like he knew Ray in certain ways, but then other people knew Ray in other ways. And we're so lucky to have the Art Institute taking good care of Bill's collection of Ray Johnson and other collections too, because I think, right, we get to read over everyone's shoulders and learn from this and take from this in our own ways. But maybe I think we're about 8:44, so we're an hour and 44 minutes into this, and I know we can go on and on, but we will. This will be up as a recording in a few weeks, probably, right, Carrie?
Yeah, probably early November.
Marvelous.
We'll
and
put it in our newsletter, and I'll send it to you as well.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Carrie. And if you're ever in Michigan, definitely visit Book Beat in Oak Park, Michigan, just outside of Royal Oak and outside of Detroit. Carrie has amazing books, as you see some behind him, but Ray would go in and do we would say performances or nothings.
Yeah.
Which, as Kira has said, can be anything and is a site of rich possibility. But Carrie is wonderful to talk with. And, it's neat to be in a space that Ray Johnson breathed in. So, I think of breath in spaces a lot. And also, Carrie has amazing Fluxus and out of print art books that you can't find anywhere else, and so many other treasures. So thank you, Carrie, for co-hosting this again.
Thanks, Julie. See you next year.
All right. Yes, we'll be back next year. Stay tuned, y'all.
Thanks, Julie and Carrie.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
y'all.
you so much,
Thanks, Mark, for
everyone.
coming.
Thanks,
Thank
Alex.
you all.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Carrie,
Karen.
for hosting.
Thank you. Have a good
Thanks,
night.
Kira and Alex.
Bye, guys.
Thank
Yes.
you.